These are Herbert's worst moments ever. In this episode, Lois planned a nice lunch with her parents, but instead of being a decent husband, Peter ditched her and went fishing with his friends. And guess what? He did it again next time too. Lois finally had enough and started arguing with him about it. That's when Brian decided to step in with a suggestion.
I need a husband who wants to spend time with me.
Can I make a suggestion? All you two have done is argue about stuff for the past 2 weeks. It's my guess you could use a vacation.
Brian, the self-proclaimed relationship expert, handing out advice like he's Dr. Phil. Meanwhile, Peter is probably thinking about where to go fishing next. Lois and Peter needed someone to watch the kids while they were gone. Peter asked Quagmire, but he immediately shut that idea down. Even Cleveland wasn't available to help. That's when Lois had an idea, though maybe not the best one.
Well, wait a minute. What about that nice old man who lives up the street?
Oh, yeah. Maybe Herbert can watch the kids. He seems like a responsible guy.
Yeah, Lois. Great idea. Let's hand over the kids to the creepiest old man in town. What could possibly go wrong? So, they went to Mr. Herbert's house to ask if he could babysit.
So it would only be till Monday, and we could pay you for it.
Yeah, and it's real easy, I promise. I mean, you've spent time watching children, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, I have.
Peter, please. This man has been waiting for this opportunity. The kids should start running now. Meanwhile, Lois and Brian were enjoying the peaceful getaway. But of course, Peter had to show up and ruin the moment.
Peter, will you knock that off? It's getting annoying.
All right, fine. I'm gonna go scare some people.
Half shark, half Peter, and 100% annoying. Lois should have left him in the ocean. Back at home, Mr. Herbert introduced the kids to some ground rules for their stay.
No cussing, clean your plates, and only a half hour of radio, and then it's off to bed.
No cussing and early bedtime? These kids are officially in boot camp. Also, why does this guy sound way too happy about this? Then, Mr. Herbert had a little extra rule just for Chris, and it was as creepy as you'd expect.
And don't you mouth off to me, or I'm gonna slap you right in your penis.
Sir, you are under arrest. The police are already on their way. Later, Mr. Herbert walked in, looking a little too excited, and asked the kids if they knew what day it was. Spoiler, they didn't.
Oh, I don't want to take a bath.
Not for you, silly. It's bath day for me. Oh, rats!
Chris, pack your bags. It's time to move to a different state, maybe a different planet. That night, Mr. Herbert was reading Chris a bedtime story, but instead of sleeping, he just kept whistling nonstop. Eventually, Chris had enough and finally asked the most important question.
Are you a pedophile?
Chris, you just asked the question the whole audience has been screaming for years. Congratulations. From creepy bedtime rules to way too much excitement over bath time, this was a disaster waiting to happen. Chris was out delivering newspapers in the neighborhood, just like every morning. He walked up to Mr. Herbert's house, all smiles, and handed over the paper. But today, something was different.
Sorry, Chris, but I'm afraid I'm gonna have to cancel my subscription.
Wait, what? Herbert is canceling? The same guy who probably wakes up at dawn just to wait for Chris? This can't be right. Chris wasn't happy about it. He had been delivering to Mr. Herbert for a long time, and the old man had always been a loyal, and let's be honest, too excited customer. So, he decided to ask why.
But you love this paper.
Listen, I think you're a real nice guy, but I've just decided to go with another paper. Hello there, Kyle. You look nice today.
Oh, mystery solved. Herbert didn't quit the newspaper. He just traded Chris for a newer model.
Shut up, old man.
Finally, someone in this town with common sense. Kyle may be a walking nightmare, but at least he knows when to tell a creep to get lost. Kyle walked away without a second thought, but Mr. Herbert? Oh no, he was not done. He just stood there, staring at him. Then, because he can't go 2 minutes without saying something disturbing, he made this comment.
What's going on in my pants? Looks like we got 6 more weeks of winter.
No, absolutely not. That's not a joke. That's an admission of guilt. Lock this man up and throw away the key. Meanwhile, across town, Peter had gone golfing with his friends. For some reason, he decided to bring Stewie along. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. Because when Peter got back home, Lois was horrified. Stewie wasn't just sun-kissed, he was sun-drenched.
Peter, you took him out without any sunscreen?
Maybe.
You know the sun is dangerous for a baby's skin.
Maybe? Peter, Stewie is glowing. He looks like he's about to be served at a barbecue. What was the plan here? To roast him until he starts speaking fluent Spanish? Back to Chris. He was still upset about losing his loyal newspaper customer, not because he missed Herbert, thankfully, but because he wanted the money. So, he came up with a plan. Go straight to Herbert's house and try to win him back.
Hey, Mr. Herbert, I want you back. Please, will you be my paper customer again?
Chris, buddy, why are you begging this man for anything? This is your chance to walk away and never look back. Take it. But Herbert? Oh, he had already moved on.
Oh, hey, Chris. Oh, is that my phone? Oh, better go get that.
Herbert really just pulled the oldest trick in the book, fake answering a phone call. Where was this energy when Chris was his paper boy? Oh, right, it didn't exist. And now that Chris lost a customer, but honestly, he should be thanking Kyle for unknowingly saving him from delivering newspapers to the creepiest man in town. Suddenly, Chris wasn't special anymore, and Herbert was way too focused on his latest interest. But as bad as getting replaced felt, running away from home was about to land Chris in way worse hands. Chris was getting bullied at school. Again, this time it was over his shoes. His classmates wouldn't let up, so he begged Lois for a new, cooler pair. But Lois? She shut him down without a second thought. Later that night, as he passed his parents' room, he spotted Peter's wallet sitting on the bed. The temptation hit him hard. He hesitated for a moment, then made up his mind.
That's it. I'm getting those sneakers. After all, shoes make the man.
Nothing says good parenting like your kid committing a felony for fashion. Maybe if Lois had just bought him some decent shoes, he wouldn't be planning a heist in his own house. Things weren't much better at home. Chris had enough. His bullies, his parents, everything. So he did what any desperate teen would do. He packed his bags and ran away.
Hi, I ran away from home. Do you mind if I live with you?
Live with me? My goodness, I feel like I'm gonna pinch myself to see if I'm dreaming.
Translation? Absolutely not, loser. Even when Chris is at his lowest, people still manage to make it worse. Somehow, Chris ended up at Mr. Herbert's house. This was already a bad idea, but it got even worse when bedtime rolled around. Chris was still wide awake, but Herbert had different plans. By the next morning, Chris was beyond uncomfortable. He needed a distraction, so he checked out Mr. Herbert's videotape collection. It was a mess. Tapes were everywhere.
I was trying to find a good movie to watch. I've never even heard of most of these.
Chris, you don't want to know what's on those tapes. Just back away slowly and pretend you never saw anything. Then Chris made an innocent mistake. He suggested they watch Lost Boys. That's when things got even weirder.
Those are different Lost Boys.
Nope. Somebody light this house on fire immediately. Chris quickly realized that living with Mr. Herbert was way worse than anything he had dealt with before. The weird conversations, the unsettling bedtime routine, the suspicious tapes. He couldn't take it anymore. But just when he thought he was stuck forever, Herbert did something unexpected. He kicked him out.
Chris, I think it's time for you to go.
Chris, nobody cares. Just run. Run like your life depends on it, because it probably does. Chris thought life on his own would be easier, but instead, he ended up right where he shouldn't be. Herbert was more than happy to take him in, and things got uncomfortable fast. Chris might have barely escaped, but his problems weren't over, especially when Peter got way too comfortable with his new boss. Lois told Peter to mow the lawn, but, Peter, being the hardworking man that he is, decided Chris should do it instead. After all, what's the point of having kids if you can't make them do chores? He promised to personally teach Chris how to do it over the weekend.
Okay, Chris, now if you're gonna learn how to mow a lawn, the first lesson is that you always start by 7 a.m. before everyone wakes up, including roosters.
Peter's parenting style. Make sure everyone is equally miserable. Chris was already dreading this lesson, but Peter had other plans. Instead of actually teaching him, he took the laziest approach possible: YouTube tutorials. Even Peter's parenting comes with a like and subscribe button. So, while Chris struggled with the mower, Peter disappeared, probably off to do some important dad things like taking a nap. Meanwhile, Mr. Herbert, the neighborhood's resident creep, came jogging over.
Hey there, Chris. I've been looking for a muscly-armed young fella to mow my lawn.
Chris barely wants to mow his own lawn. No way he's signing up for this. But then, Mr. Herbert hit him with an offer too good to ignore.
You got a deal.
And I can pay you under the table. I like to make a little fort under there.
Nothing says totally normal job like a sketchy under-the-table payment and a homemade fort. The next morning, Peter and Chris show up at Mr. Herbert's house ready to earn some cash. But before they even got started, Herbert seemed more interested in Peter. Peter just got mistaken for a child. Somewhere, Lois is screaming into a pillow as Chris slaved away under the burning sun. Mr. Herbert came out with a plate of freshly baked cookies and a pitcher of grape juice. Before Chris could even react, Peter launched himself at the snacks like a wild animal. Oh, Chris just lost his only supporter to a grown man with no self-control. At this point, Chris had had enough. He looked up from the sweaty mess that was his life and saw Peter and Mr. Herbert playing around like two giddy schoolgirls. That was it. He was done.
It's time you did all the work and I goof off with Mr. Herbert.
Chris tried to turn the tables, but Peter refuses to retire from his position as the laziest man alive. This led to an all-out father-son brawl in the middle of Herbert's yard, and in the heat of the fight, Chris accidentally called Peter Dad. Suddenly, Herbert had a realization, and it was not a good one. Peter and Chris took on a simple lawn mowing job, but Herbert had other plans. While Chris worked, Peter was too busy stuffing his face with drugged cookies, leaving Chris to deal with the creep alone. Chris barely made it out of this job, but next, he'd be working off a debt for someone just as bad. Peter was at work, but let's be honest, he wasn't actually working. Instead of doing his job, he was too busy sulking over why he never gets named Employee of the Month. Someone else got the honor, and Peter, he was not happy.
How come I'm never Employee of the Month? Man, this is the worst job I've had since I was the conductor for the Sand People Choir.
Peter, you have to actually do work to get an award. Watching YouTube at your desk does not count. Meanwhile, Chris was outside playing cricket with his friends. Everything was going fine until Chris swung a little too hard, and the ball went flying straight through Mr. Herbert's window. That's the universal sound of a kid realizing he just ruined his own day. Chris and his friends did what any kids would do in this situation. They ran for their lives. The next day, Chris was sitting on the couch watching TV with his parents when the doorbell rang. Lois went to answer it, and there stood their creepy old neighbor, Mr. Herbert.
Oh, hi, Herbert. What brings you here?
It seems your son's baseball broke one of my windows the other day.
Oh, my God. I am so sorry.
Chris was hoping for a slap on the wrist. Instead, his wallet took the hit. Lois thought it was only fair for Chris to pay for the damage, but Mr. Herbert had other ideas. He made an offer that, well, let's just say it wasn't normal. While Chris was dreading his new job, Stewie was causing his own set of problems. His kindergarten teacher showed Lois a bunch of his drawings. Every single one of them was about killing her. The teacher said it was because Lois wasn't spending enough time with him. Lois took it seriously, but Peter, not so much. The next day, Peter tried to bond with Stewie, but Stewie wasn't interested until one thing changed his mood.
I actually saw bullet wounds.
You can't just take him places you want to go. He's a baby.
Look, Lois, I think I know how to spend time with my own kid, all right?
Stewie only bonds over two things: violence and watching his mom suffer. Back to Chris, who had to show up at Mr. Herbert's house to work off his debt. The moment he arrived, Herbert welcomed him with another classic dose of weirdness. Chris was just here to mow the lawn, not audition for an R-rated Old Man in the Sea. As if that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Herbert then took Chris out to a fancy dinner. Chris, unaware of how bizarre this was, politely thanked him for the meal.
Oh, I wanted to thank you properly for all your hard work.
Souvenir photograph?
Hell yes!
Chris thought this was just a nice dinner. Herbert was planning a romantic scrapbook. Later that night, Herbert sat alone, staring at the photo of him and Chris, completely lost in his creepy little fantasy. If there was ever a time to call the police, it was right now. Between strange comments, weird chores, and way too many red flags, it was clear this was not a normal job. Chris thought this was bad, but wait until he gets caught up in Herbert's version of Star Wars. The episode kicked off with a power cut. Everything went dark, and no one knew what to do. Brian, trying to be the voice of reason, suggested they light some candles and read something. But Meg, she had a different plan. Storytelling. She asked if they could talk about the story of her birth, hoping for a sweet family moment. But Peter, he shut that down real fast and changed the subject.
This is the story of Star Wars. Let's begin with part 4.
Classic Peter. Why have a sentimental moment when you can force your family into a Star Wars recap instead? Meanwhile, Chris had a major problem. His robot had gone missing and he had no idea where it went. So with Quagmire by his side, he set out to find it. Quagmire, of course, entertained himself by listening to the radio on the way. After some searching, they finally spotted the missing robot.
He says there are several creatures approaching from the southeast.
That's not what I said. I said there ain't a pack of menthols on this planet.
Even the robot is better at survival than Chris. That's never a good sign. Curious about the approaching creatures, Chris started looking around. That's when it happened. Bam! He was attacked out of nowhere. After taking a hit, he barely got a look at his attacker before a guy in brown ran off.
Who the hell are you?
One lucky sumbitch.
If a stranger in a robe touches you while you're unconscious, it's time to rethink all your life choices. Turns out, the mystery man was none other than Mr. Herbert. Though in Peter's Star Wars story, he was going by the name Mr. Obi-Wan. He took Chris back to his place, acting like a wise old mentor. But his usual interests? Yeah, they didn't take long to show up. Chris was looking for help. Mr. Obi-Wan was looking for, muscle appreciation time? After listening to the long message, Mr. Obi-Wan finally explained what was going on. He handed Chris a laser sword and started preparing him for battle. Nothing screams wise mentor like immediately giving a teenager a deadly weapon without instructions. Chris was trying to stay focused, but something clicked in his head. If the Empire figured out who the Jawas had sold the droids to, they could trace them back to home, and that was a problem.
Luke, wait! It's too dangerous!
Chris, making a smart decision, marked this day in history. Mr. Obi-Wan helped them out on their journey, but let's be honest, he was not in his prime. That became painfully obvious when he got caught by an enemy. His laser sword? It barely worked. His opponent, sensing how weak he was, laughed right in his face.
Uh-oh.
Your powers are weak, old man.
You know you're washed up when even your enemy starts roasting you mid-fight. Then, just when it seemed like Obi-Wan was finished, Chris showed up and yelled his name. And somehow, just like that, Obi-Wan's power came back. So his secret power source was Chris? That explains way too much. What should have been a legendary adventure turned into one awkward moment after another. Chris barely survived this version of Star Wars, but soon, he'd be trapped with Herbert in real life, this time at a birthday party. Chris got invited to a birthday party by a girl from his school. That alone was enough to send him into a full-blown excitement spiral. He wanted to make a good impression. No, a great impression. But first, he needed advice on what to get her. Naturally, he turned to the expert on boys giving gifts, Meg.
I want to get Barbara a really nice gift. What kind of gifts have boys gotten for you, Meg?
Oh, well,
Meg, struggling to answer this is more painful than Chris's social skills. Spoiler, no boy has ever given Meg a gift. Chris wasn't just worried about the party. He had his usual job delivering newspapers, which meant another day of dealing with his customers. And today, he got stopped by an old man who, let's be honest, looked way too eager to see him.
Oh, hey there, young fella. Bringing me good news today?
What?
Come on over here, son.
If someone ever asks you to step closer so they don't need to use the grabber, you run. Chris, being the polite kid he was, handed him the paper. But instead of a quick thank you, this man decided to take things in a very uncomfortable direction. The day of the birthday party finally arrived, but things didn't go as planned. Chris, being his awkward self, managed to make everything weird. The next day, he was back on his paper route, still feeling down about it. That's when this old, too friendly newspaper customer stopped him again.
Hey, muscly arm. Why the long face?
Oh, it's this girl.
If someone offers you a popsicle as life advice, you might want to reconsider talking to them. And just like that, the popsicle trick was in motion. The creepy old man took this as his big chance and invited Chris somewhere. Well, somewhere really weird. Nothing says run for your life quite like a guy whispering about popsicles in a basement. After all the chaos, awkward parties, creepy old men, and questionable life decisions, the Griffin family finally made it back home. They were expecting peace, but what they weren't expecting? A total of 113 voice messages waiting for them.
Yeah, I was just wondering, where the newspaper boy was.
113 messages? Either the newspaper is really important, or this is next-level stalker behavior. And it didn't stop there. No, this guy took his obsession with Chris to new heights. He left another message, but this time, the tone had changed.
Just lonely here, thinking about the muscly arm paper boy.
Started with longing, ended with a full-blown threat. This went from "where's my newspaper" to "call me or else" real quick. At this point, Chris probably needed more than just newspaper money. Maybe a security system, maybe a lawyer, or maybe just a new address. And let's just say, Herbert was a little too interested in making the night special. Chris managed to get out of this one, but soon he'd befriend somebody just as dangerous without even knowing it. Lois started getting worried about Chris. His personal amusement was getting out of control, and it was clear he needed a distraction. Brian suggested they help him find a hobby. Peter took the idea and ran with it, deciding to get Chris involved in something, anything.
Wait a minute, Brian, that's a great idea. Chris needs a hobby. Hey, Chris, get in here.
Chris agreeing to this way too quickly means one of two things. He's either desperate or just doesn't want to argue with his dad. Later that day, Chris and Peter were walking past Mr. Herbert's house. As expected, Herbert immediately called out to Chris, asking what he was up to.
Please, God, let me just sniff his hat.
Meanwhile, Herbert is probably hoping Chris's hobby involves visiting old men. Peter dragged Chris away, but Herbert wasn't ready to let go just yet. Oh no, he had his own special request. Peter kept throwing out ideas for hobbies, but Chris wasn't interested in any of them. Just as Peter was about to give up, Chris spotted something across the street, a puppet shop. The moment he walked inside, he was amazed by the huge collection of puppets. The real work in progress here is Chris's ability to sense danger. Spoiler alert, it's non-existent. It seemed like Chris had finally found his hobby, but just as things were settling down, the Griffin family got a surprise visitor, Mr. Herbert. He showed up at their house apologizing for bothering them, but he had something urgent to tell them about Chris.
He's bad news.
Why? What's the problem?
Chris is friends with a Nazi.
Nothing says casual evening at home like your creepy neighbor bursting in with war crimes allegations. Herbert then launched into a dramatic backstory about how he knew Franz, the man running the puppet shop, and why he was dangerous.
So that's why Chris should stay away from that puppet store guy.
It all sounds kind of sketchy.
Peter calling something sketchy? The man who hangs out with a talking dog and has been in multiple accidents? Since Chris's parents weren't taking him seriously, Herbert decided to go straight to Chris himself. He caught him before he went back to the puppet shop and tried to warn him.
Chris, his name isn't Guten Tag, it's Schlicknacht, and he's a Nazi.
Herbert with the biggest plot twist since Chris learned what deodorant is. Chris wasn't buying it. He actually believed Franz was a nice guy and defended him. Chris thinking this guy as his friend is proof he'd probably help a vampire because they looked lonely. Herbert kept pushing, but Chris had officially had enough. And, well, he let Herbert have it. Meanwhile, Peter had his own approach to the situation. Instead of keeping Chris away from Franz, he invited him over for dinner. Because nothing fixes a potential international criminal situation like a nice home-cooked meal. Eventually, Chris did realize the truth. Franz was a Nazi. By the time he figured it out, it was too late. Franz locked both him and Peter in his basement. There was only one tiny window to the outside world, and by some miracle, Mr. Herbert happened to walk by. Chris called out to him.
You were right, Mr. Herbert. Franz is a Nazi.
Chris admitting Herbert was right? This might be the most shocking part of the story. Herbert didn't waste time. He went home, dug out his old army uniform, and personally took down Franz. After a whole battle, he won and Chris got out of the basement.
Thanks for everything, Mr. Herbert. If only I had listened to you, none of this would have happened.
Herbert finally getting a normal moment with Chris. Too bad it took an actual hostage situation to happen. And just like that, Chris learned two valuable lessons that day. Never trust a Nazi, and never let Peter pick his friends. Chris thought he found a new friend in an old puppet shop owner, but Herbert knew the truth. This guy wasn't just creepy, he was dangerous. But of course, Chris ignored the warning signs and walked right into trouble. Escaping this guy would be tough, but later, even a simple yard sale would put Chris back in Herbert's sights. The episode starts with the Griffin family hosting a yard sale. Peter, being Peter, was trying to get rid of his junk, while Chris was also selling some of his old things. Of course, it didn't take long for Mr. Herbert to show up.
Hi, Mr. Herbert.
Selling your old hand-me-downs?
Yep.
Chris is out here trying to make a quick buck, but Herbert is here for something else. Something much worse. Herbert eyed Chris's stuff, pretending to be interested, but as expected, his questions got weird real fast. Chris was feeling miserable. He sat there looking defeated when Lois walked in, trying to check on him. She asked about his first day at rehab, but Chris had had enough.
Friends, nobody wants anything to do with me.
Chris thought rehab would fix everything. Turns out his reputation is still in the gutter. The good news about Chris had spread like wildfire, and how people were avoiding him like he had the plague. Even Mr. Herbert, of all people, wanted nothing to do with him.
Hi, Mr. Herbert.
Oh my God! Children, run!
When even the town's biggest creep is scared of you, you know things are bad. But the real shocker? Mr. Herbert had a whole bunch of kids with him. And when he panicked, they all disappeared into some secret underground basement. Yeah, that raised more questions than it answered. Wait, safety basement? Why does Herbert even have a basement full of kids? This just got 10 times more disturbing.
I completed that sex rehab and I paid my debt to society, but people are still afraid of me, like I'm some kind of creep.
And that's a wrap on Herbert's worst moments ever. If you want to see the times Chris Griffin went full psycho, check out that video right here.